According to Ashley Crossman, the self is socially constructed in the sense that it is shaped through interaction with other people. For George Herbert Mead, the self is a symbolic interactionism. It seems that Dewey's theory of education is the tautology of the self, for both are characterized as social processes. This lesson's composition will be discussing the theory of George Herbert Mead, John Dewey's concept of education, Charles Horton Cooley's looking glass self, as a proof that the self has its own mind. According to some authors, Vygotsky never wrote about the self, but his theory on social interaction between learning and development of the self. Learning objectives. At the end of the lesson, students should understand the relation of the self to themselves and the self as a social process. Interpret the differences of Mead's theory concerning the I and the me. Explain the importance of Dewey's theory of education in relation to the Mead's theory of the self. And explore the self through Charles Horton Cooley's looking glass self. The self is an individual that has its own perspective. According to Mead, the self is a social process. Zahavi states that one cannot be a self on one's own, but only together with others. The maturation of the self is a complex social process. They have also insisted that the sense of self is an integral and fundamental part of conscious life, which the infant is already in possession of from birth onward. That would mean that the self is a composition of two roles: the role of the self for itself and the role of the self towards others. Since self is a multifaceted entity, from birth until the last day of one's living, the development is gradually based on the experience from others. Example: the story of Tarzan. Tarzan's behavior is not parallel to humans precisely because he grew with apes and other animals rather than his. The way he speaks, moves, and thinks is different from ours. But eventually, when he met people like us, he adopted everything the way we act and think. Therefore, self's development depends on how the self will agree to the conformities of one's environment. What is the self in a social context? The self has meaning only within the social context, and it is not wrong to say that the social situation defines our self-concept and our self-esteem. We rely on others to provide a social reality to determine what to think, feel, and do. Man finds his only purpose with social settings, meaning he must participate in any activities that occur in any situation. Therefore, it is essential to consider the self as a political entity because his community involvement is worth it. The social process. Vygotsky's theories stress the fundamental role of social interaction in the development of cognition. This would mean that the social interaction gives meaning to self-recognition. In other words, there is a cognitive process that the self must be developed, and that is only through the learning process of language, thought, and reasoning. Education is a social process. Education is growth. Education is not preparation for life, but is life itself. Why is education being highly essential for John Dewey? When an individual starts to make sense, problems arise, such as culture and tradition, politics, religion, society, etc. Then, the opportunity to change the world comes in. But there is one thing that an individual should understand and find a solution to how the self reacts to its environment. That is, one must be practical in dealing with it. Therefore, education is the only solution to that problem. Mead's theory of the self and Dewey's theory of education are inseparable. Both self and knowledge, that is, education, pertain to a social process. Therefore, it is a tautology of an education. In other words, the self is education or education is a self. Hence, the learning process is acquainted with it. One cannot educate himself without an educator. Educator here refers to the self as an educator and the others. That is even nurtured by the learning experience process, meaning that one must not rely only on oneself. Remember when we discussed knowing thyself in week 1. To know oneself is to abandon the self itself. If one needs the self to be educated by the others, the self must submit himself to society since no man can live alone by himself. There is something that one should know about the importance of the self. The self is an unending journey precisely because man is continuously searching for meaning. When one is searching for the meaning of himself, one should travel on a roadless path. If I and me have different connotations, then why are they inseparable? The I is the pure form of the self and the me is the social form of the self. If I is a subject of the self as me is its object, then how could an individual relate his very self to himself? One must understand that the I is the knower and the me is the known. The realm of understanding concerning the self is profoundly a dualistic being by which the self transcends to another entity that is to be known by the knower. In other words, one must see the I as a thinking self, that it is not the only composition of the self, but it has a me that lives along the I. The moment the self thinks of something, it means that the I is having a dialogue with the me. Through this process, the unity of the I and the me is called the self. One cannot live as a thinking self without the composition of the I and the me. Therefore, the self is the totality of the I and the me. How does the self develop? According to Mead's theory, the self is developed through three activities: language, play, and game. Language allows people to take on the role of the other and respond to their own behaviors through the symbolized attitudes of others. During play, individuals take on the roles of different people and pretend to be them to express their expectations. The process of the role playing is key to the generation of self-consciousness and to the general development of the self. This is the reason why people must comprehend the rules of the game and internalize the roles of everyone else involved. The looking glass self comprises three main components that are unique to humans. First, we imagine how we must appear to others in a social situation. Second, we imagine and react to what we feel their judgment of that appearance must be. Third, we develop our sense of self and respond through this perceived judgment of others. Therefore, both the self and the mind are inseparable. Though they have different functions, but they play as one in order for the self to be developed by the others through experience. Therefore, the self that has mind within is an interactive self.